What is up, guys? Today we're going to be doing part 4 of the Back to Basics series where we look at the fundamentals of Psytrance music production. And in this video we're going to be using the techniques from videos 1, 2, and 3 where we looked at different hi-hat patterns, snare grooves, and snare roll patterns. And what we're going to do is we're going to assemble a full drum loop on top of a kick and bass. Then we'll look at individual processing and how I route stuff to groups and what we would do on the group processing. So if that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned till the end of this video because we're going to be going into the Cubase project here that we've been working on and putting together that full drum loop right after this intro. What is up, guys? You're watching Claritone Audio. For those of you that are new here, my name is Killian. You might know me by my Psytrance project NaiLiK. As I explained in today's intro, we're going to be doing the 4th part of the Back to Basics series where we start to build the full drum loop. So we'll jump right into the project. As soon as I mention the usual things, check out the links down below if you want to check out my private Discord server, if you want to join the Facebook group that I started. We're at over 4K members now. It's a great resource for anybody that wants to learn about Psytrance production. If you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon links. I've also got a lot of cool stuff up there and cool offers depending on the tiers that you take. So we'll jump right into Cubase and start assembling the loop. I'm going to select a couple different drum samples. I'll import those and we'll build up the full drum loop and then we'll go from there. So let's hop right into Cubase. Alright guys, here we are in that same Cubase project that we started and have been using since the beginning of the Back to Basics series. What we've done is we've used this loop to assemble all of the different patterns that we used in videos 1, 2, and 3, but now I've imported all of the samples that I want to use in my drum loop, and the pattern is not assembled. So we've got all of our loose samples here, and a couple I imported a top loop and a cinematic loop that I'm going to try and incorporate into this drum loop. And we've started back from square one. We're going to apply all of these techniques, and then we'll go over the grouping. First things first, let's get all of our drum samples placed in the classic 4 on the floor Psytrance drum loop pattern. And for the hi-hats, like I said, we'll apply techniques that we used in the videos 1, 2, and 3. The only thing that's changed since the last video, as producers, every time we open a project, we come back to it with fresh ears. I did update a bit of the processing on the kick. I imported, or I added, I should say, a little Diamond EQ by Studioclaritone Audio. And I probably slightly changed a bit the processing on the bass, just the frequency of the low shelf and stuff like that. So what we have here is our kick and bass and solo. Let's listen to this loop and then we'll start doing the pattern. So you've got your killer kick and bass and you're ready to start assembling the loop. Let's first listen to all the samples that I've imported as the samples that I want to assemble my loop with. This is our snare drum. I'll do a later video on how I combined 4 snares to make this my main snare. But for now, let's just take a listen to all the samples that I've selected. Here's the crash sample that I'm using from the new Outsiders pack. It's just a pretty long crash. I like my crashes nice and long, and I've trimmed it to 4 bars so that I could have a reversed copy. So my reverse copy ends right before the last kick and where the bass ends. So it sounds like this with the kick and bass. Here's the open hi-hat sample that I chose. It's a really snappy, like 808, 909 style, or I should say 808 style open hat. Here is the close hat that we're going to use, which is the same one from the hi-hats pattern video. Here, we'll play it in case you haven't seen the video. So it's a really, really short hi-hat that I've got here. We can reduce the fade out a little bit to make it slightly longer. This is a top loop that I've imported from the Future Phonics pack from Divination or Signwriter. So I'm just going to stretch that over by using my sizing applies time stretch tool, and it snaps right on the grid. The next thing I've got here is a 140 BPM cinematic loop. First, let's listen to that top loop. Here we've got this cinematic drum loop. We might use it, we might not, but I imported it anyways. Again, we're going to use sizing applies time stretch and just nudge that over so that it's exactly 2 bars, and it'll squish everything to be within that measure. So these should all be synced up to my project BPM of 142 now, and we're ready to start assembling the loop. So I'll put my kick and bass into solo here, and we'll start with the snare pattern, which is going to play every second kick. So you're going to want to copy it every second kick, and just keep duplicating them until you get to the full length of your loop that you're building. I like to build my loops at about 32 beats length because that's typically the size measure that I like to work in. I'll glue everything together in that length so that it's nice and easy to copy and paste within my project. So some of these levels are already preset just because I've kind of used them already in the project. After we start assembling all the pattern, we'll go over levels that I typically use, and that generally gets me my in the right ballpark. The next thing we're going to do is our crash, which is already placed, so we'll just put that one into solo as well. Let's put our closed hi-hat here first. We're going to go into 16th notes, and we'll do, I believe it was pattern number 3, which is pretty much just lower the volume of every first copy. So one a little bit lower, then on full volume, then another one a little bit lower, and repeat every, on a 16th note pattern. So I'm just duplicating this over and over, and then I'll glue them all together like I did with my snares using the 4 shortcut, which is the glue tool, so that I can just even more quickly copy them all over at the right length. So if we solo that, here's what we've got so far. And what we might do is reduce how much the first one is lower. Maybe we'll go with like 6 dBs. So I'm going to glue it again, and now I can just hold duplicate and it'll keep copying over, and then bang, we glue them all together. So again, the levels are kind of already in the right ballpark, but we'll go over that later. Next thing we're going to do is our open hi-hat pattern, which is going to play on every upbeat, or the 3rd 16th. So in between the kick and the snare sample, right in the middle of that, so that we get this. If we listen to just the kick, the snare, and the open hi-hat, we can see that they all play at a different time. Right, now we throw back in our closed hi-hat, and it's starting to get a little bit more busy, and it's starting to roll. So we'll continue copying that over and glue it together. And that is typically what you would usually have to build up your 4 on the floor, just a basic dance music pattern. The drums will typically follow exactly this pattern, if not, slight variation on the closed hi-hats or something. So now we can also spice it up. Let's listen to what we have, and then I'm actually going to duplicate my open hi-hat, and we'll have another drum layer after that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on my open hi-hat channel, and I'm going to click duplicate this channel. Now I'll make this one slightly lighter so that it's a little bit easier to focus on. So this is the one that we're looking at here. The open hi-hat is placed on the third, but what we're going to do is we're going to nudge this over 2/16ths so that it plays right on top of the kick. Now I'm just adjusting my clips here so that it starts on the first beat and that it's still a 4-bar clip that's glued together. So if we listen to this now, it's going to sound like complete garbage. It's going to be a really big mess, but you'll see where this goes in a couple seconds. So what I'm going to do to focus in on this is I'm going to solo the new duplicated track as well as the original open hi-hat. And I'm going to select the duplicate that's playing on top of the kick. And we'll look at the fader here and we're going to slowly start to pull this volume down. And it's going to give us a really, really cool groove. But it's got to be almost inaudible. So somewhere right around there is what I would probably start with. We can hear it's almost inaudible, but when I cut it out completely, it's obviously not inaudible. So when we add that into the whole drum loop, I'll turn it on and off so that you can hear that it's kind of adding this extra speed to the open hi-hat and it's giving it a lot more groove. So this is currently how we had it without it, and then after a couple of beats I'll just solo it in so that we add the second hi-hat in, the second open hi-hat. Now in the context of the loop, it's still a little bit too loud, so we're going to go ahead and drop it down another couple dBs. So let's maybe try minus 40 dBs. We'll drop it down another 6 dBs. That's exactly what we wanted right there. So now again, I'll take it out and we'll listen to the loop without it, and then after a couple beats, I'll add it in again. We could even possibly adjust the length of these by just going into all of the audio samples and adding a small fade out. Right, so that's adding a lot of groove right there. I really like that. The next thing we'll import is this top loop, which again is going to be something that's mixed almost to the point that it's inaudible, but it's going to be adding a lot of movement and a lot of, a lot more of a sense of fullness to the loop. So let's start this one with the volume fader all the way down, and then we'll slowly raise it up until we obviously notice it until it's to our taste. So no drum loop, and when we pull it up, you're going to hear that it gets a lot busier, but we don't want to pull it up too loud. So I'm going to keep monitoring that peak loudness here, and it's probably going to end up somewhere below minus 20. Maybe I'll add something like LFO tool on it, and we'll try and give it a bit of pumping. Of course, it doesn't have EQ. We can shape it. We can allow it to, have its own position or its own place within the loop. But we'll go on to the processing on the individual channels just after we add this last one, which is our cinematic loop. I'm not quite sure if this one's going to work, but I know right off the bat what I will do is add a little bit of a low cut here. Probably start it off around 120. Again, I'm just duplicating this to the full length of my pattern, and if I want, I could select them all and just glue them all together so that it's one piece. going to lower the fader again and then slowly introduce the volume of this new cinematic loop here. So I'm really liking what that cinematic loop is doing actually, but what I'm going to do is probably add some saturation to it so that it can maybe pop through the mix a little bit better. Just use maybe the tube preset. We'll go ahead and add a couple bands to it and we'll tweak it while we listen to the loop. Just testing this small little bit of bit crushing just to give it a little bit more grittiness. I'm going to see if it works with our drum loop here. But the Saturn is definitely, of course, changing the balance of it, kind of working like an EQ, but it's definitely adding some more harmonics and filling it in. We don't need it to be so bassy, we need it to be a little bit more mid-range focused, so I'm just trying to get that quickly here. I'm going to leave this in the video so you guys can see how I would approach kind of starting to do the processing if it doesn't really fit, but you really like what the drum is doing. So. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was how I group stuff down. Obviously, I color code everything that's important in my loop. So all my kick and bass tend to be red. Then my snares and my percussion and all of the stuff that's going to be in my perc group is going to go to a light yellow or dark yellow color. And then besides that, I'll start to group things out. So the way I like to group stuff is I don't put everything together right away. I'll send them to different groups, and if I have to, I'll group the groups to another group later. What I mean by that is I'll tend to group down my kick and bass. Then if I don't render down all of my snares, and actually even in the case where I do have a rendered down snare, because later on I'm gonna spice up the loop and add like the cool snare patterns and the other snare rolls and everything else, I'll tend to throw my main snares to, or all of my snares to another group. And the reason I put these into separate groups is so that I can apply filtering on the groups instead of on the individual channels where, I might have to redo the filter on all 4 snare channels instead of just on the group. So, and that too, same thing with the kick and bass. I like to filter my kick and bass together. If I want to do some part of the track where I'll filter the bass differently to the kick, then I'll just do that part on the actual track automation below the track. But that's a rare occurrence. So I'll throw those into a group, and then typically everything else except for my crash will go to just a percussion or all hats group. So let's start by doing this right away. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select all the channels that I want to send to the group, and then I'll hold Alt-Shift. And then this is just going to go to my kick bass group. This I'll send right away to my snare groups, or snare group. Now, I mentioned that I'm going to skip the crash from sending that to a group, and the reason I do that is because if I add filtering on my hat group, I don't want to have my crash in there because I want to have that crash hitting on the first beat, even if my percussion is fully filtered, for example. So I skip this one. This one does not have a group. It also doesn't go into any, compression that I might do on the drum group or anything like that. So we'll skip that one. We'll jump down to all of the loops and all of the hi-hats samples that we've, made patterns for. We'll send that over to our hats group. Now, if for some reason I need to apply something or want to change the volume of all of these together, I can go and adjust the groups all together, or I would create a new group called All Drums plus Kick Bass, and then go up to these group channels that I have here and set their outputs to that new group that I would have just created. So that's how I like to group everything, and I explained a little bit the logic behind why I would group things individually before sending them down to another group, if I even have to do that at all. And then on the group channel, I would do things like some bus compression, maybe some group saturation. I'll have another EQ open because I like to do that filtering on my groups with just a high pass and a low pass in FabFilter. It has a lot more control and it's really, really smooth sounding. So before we jump over to the individual processing, we'll add some cool stuff and spice up our loop. So I'm going to cheat. You should review parts 1, 2, and 3 of the Back to Basics series. I just threw one of my snare patterns into this loop here. And I'm not going to have a snare roll playing every single 32 beats. So once this pattern gets copied over 2 times, we can see here I've added a snare roll just for the second copy. What I'm going to do is I'll probably cut out the last bar of kick and bass here, and I'll cut all of these percussions along to go with it, and then I'll bump down this snare roll so that it ends again right where the last kick does. Hope that makes sense. We can take a listen to the second half of this loop here. So where we have this increasing speed snare roll, I kind of want to have more space for it, so I'm going to filter off my kick and bass and percussion. So I would just come up to my top kick bass group. We can see I've got this basic EQ preset loaded, which I use on my group channels, which is just a 24 dB high pass and low pass. I'll turn on write mode in my automation. I'll click play and I'll adjust the frequency so that it creates the automation lane automatically, and then I'll usually edit the automation with my pencil tool. So we can see it created this automation lane right underneath, so I'll just go ahead and delete all of those nodes. And from this point on until 1 bar, which is where the kick is ending, 1 bar before, so 48, I want to have this high pass rising. So I'm just going to automate it with a slight curve like that. And this should be filtering up our kick and bass. We can do the same on our hat group and snare group just after that. So I just put that a couple of samples before, just so that I never have the transient of my kick cut off because of latency or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the same type of automation to both of the other groups, and then we'll go move over to the processing section of this video. Now we can see on that last beat here, or this last bar, I should say, we've got the perfect opportunity for a cool kick fill, which I've also got a video on that I did earlier, not part of the Back to Basics series, but I'll try and post a link somewhere up here below or down in the comments if you want to check that out too. But we won't do that right away. We'll jump over to the processing. So what I would do, my approach would generally be to get every sample sounding as clean as it can and reduce all of the frequencies or resonances or aspects of the sound that I don't like on the individual channels. So some basic EQ, maybe some saturation, depending on what we're looking at here. So let's say we take this closed hi-hat, for example. There isn't a whole lot to cut, so some might be opposed to cutting it. I would generally just still make a cut because I'm going to be using other bands of the EQ anyways. I would just kind of cut it anyways. So again, correctional EQ, stuff that you don't like. Do a lot of cutting, boosting, whatever you want. Add effects to it. Things that I typically won't add on the individual channel unless I'm really trying to affect the envelope of the sound would be like compression. On some of the drum loops that we have down at the bottom here, like the top loops, things that I would usually do would be, again, EQ, some basic effects, maybe distortion, bit crushing, and probably if the loop is super dynamic, I would use a limiter just to reduce the dynamic range of that loop. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of group processing on some of these channels, and then we'll move on to group compression, bus compression, and maybe some saturation slightly on the whole group. Because the open hi-hat that's mixed super low is the same one, I'm just going to copy over that EQ. Next, we'll look at how I would process some of these drum loops that we've got, the top loops that we've imported. In my top loops, typically I want not a lot of mid-range either. I want them to kind of just sit in their own place on top. Maybe in a certain section of the track, if it's just kick, bass, and loop, and I'm going to have this loop playing, I might make a duplicate or automate the EQ to reduce some of that. I'm You can see the spectrum's already pretty smooth. There's not a lot of stuff. If there's something that, an area that you want to dip, maybe for your snare or another element that needs to pop through, we can not listen to it in solo, and we can kind of listen to the drum loop as a whole, and you know, maybe there'll be something else that we want to scoop out of that. Might try and add some saturation on that to really crunch the mid-range. We'll add 2 bands, not kind of affecting, you know, the super low frequencies, and you know, nothing above maybe like 2 to 5K depending on what we're trying to do here. We'll go with a heavy saturation in the mid band, and we'll just kind of crank that drive as we listen to it. Next, we'll process this second loop, which we already cleaned up a little bit, but we'll see if we can squeeze a little bit more out of it. Now here's a good example of just looking at the waveform. I can see that it's quite a bit, got quite a bit of dynamics and some individual peaks on some of those samples. So if this was playing on its own, you probably wouldn't want to add a limiter or, you know, crunch it down too much, because you're going to lose a lot of the transient. But this is one of those cases where I'd rather the sound be consistent and you'd be able to hear each hit a little bit better in the mix. Since we're probably not going to hear a whole lot of transient, it's mixed in the background of the whole drum loop on, you know, underneath the kick and everything else that we want to give space for those transients. So for this, I'm just going to, you know, make it a little bit more consistent. Let's just try like an L1. We're going to use it to make it a little bit more consistent, and then we'll be able to mix it a little bit lower in the mix, because we won't have certain peaks that are playing right at the right volume, and then certain hits that are, you know, a little bit too low and not so audible for us. So I'll probably just try and link them and see how much gain reduction I get and hear what it sounds like. Another thing I'll do is I'll watch the meter here, and if I see that its biggest peak is at about -6, then I know I can probably go to -8, -9, and I'll get about 3 dBs of reduction. So that's what I'm looking at as I'm looking at this limiters interface. So we'll listen to it in the context of our mix here, and hopefully we'll be able to reduce the volume or it'll at least sound a lot more consistent. Another thing we can try is adding our own send reverb on it that I've already got set up in the project. Let's try like a medium chamber. This might make it sound completely, worse, but now that we've started to put some processing and effects on the individual channels, it's probably time for a rebalance, or you haven't done a rebalance or balance to this point. So generally what I like to do to make sure I have enough headroom at the end of my mix is I'll have my kick peaking around -10. My bass will be a little bit below that by probably about a dB and a half peak. So let's start by soloing stuff one by one, and we'll look at the peak level. Peak level doesn't tell you everything because, of course, a sound with the same peak level can have a different RMS and it'll be perceived louder. But still, it's a good starting point. So my kick will be at around -10 peak. With my bass slightly below that. In this case, it's about a dB 0.8 below the kick. My snare will probably be about -15 peak, and that's about a 5 dB difference from the kick. But of course, it's always good to listen to how much volume it actually has in reference to your kick. Once you've got both of your samples selected and your processing down, you'll be able to make a better judgment of that. In this case, it's going to be about -16, -16.5, but that sounds pretty good to me so far. Next, we've got our snare groove snares. So this was already mixed. We can see it's quite low, but we might need to adjust that a little more. There's really not much of a science behind the numbers. It's ending up at around, I would probably have guessed around -20, but it ends up being around -26. So you just have to listen, use your ears, get stuff in the right ballpark, but then when you've adjusted everything and you know how it's going to sound, then you can fine-tune that level and really just use your ears and listen to where it should be sitting in relation to everything else. Snare roll, I'm going to raise the volume a little bit because our snare was peaking at -16, so our snare roll can probably end up somewhere right around there. My crash, I'll end up typically using a -17 to like 19 peak level. Same thing with hi-hats, open hi-hats. They'll generally be about -16.5 to maybe -20. Depending on where you like them to sit, sometimes you might even mix your closed hi-hats a little bit lower or your open hi-hats a little bit lower than that. And again, these numbers don't work as just some kind of magic formula, and especially it will be depend on what level your kick is at. If you end up mixing your kick at about -11, then it'll probably be about a dB lower than that peak as well. So They're kind of in relation to each other. They have a certain ratio. So all of these closed hi-hats, I'll just listen to them one by one, open hi-hats, and I'll get them somewhere comfortably around -17, but just where they feel good. Loops again. They can sit anywhere from -17 to maybe -25. Sometimes you want the loop almost really inaudible, but it's going to be adding some movement. So that's up to you to judge and place it wherever you feel it's working and see if it needs more volume, if there's more space for it or not. In this case, it's even below -25. So that about wraps it up for the individual processing, the color coding, and kind of the levels that I use as a base point, a starting point to get me in the right ballpark, just so that I can continue assembling my loop without things being ridiculously loud. And then once I go ahead and add all the effects and the individual processing, which of course affects the volume and the perceived loudness of each sample or loop, you're then ready to give it a rebalance. And again, those numbers are a guideline. You just listen to it and you let it sit wherever you feel it sits right. Next, we'll move on to how I would process the groups. And we'll look at group processing as well as some parallel compression and other techniques that we can use to fatten up our drum sound. As I already showed you how I group down my drums into different groups, I did also explain that, sometimes I might add, saturation on just the snares. So in that case, I'm using group processing so that I don't have to copy the same VST onto all of the individual channels for that processing to be applied to all of them. Then I would go ahead, if I want to process my whole group, the first thing that I would do, I would love to apply some bus compression to the whole perc loop minus my crashes, which are not part of any group. So the first thing I'll do is I'll take a new group channel. I'm going to call this all percs. So it's going to be this purple channel down here at the bottom. So I'll take my snare group and my hi-hat group, and instead of them going to stereo out, we're going to route them over to that group before they hit the stereo out. So now if I add a compressor onto this all perc group, it's going to be applied to all of the percussion, the the hi-hat samples, the loops, and the snares as one. So what I would probably do is, I really am a big fan of SSL style compression, which I'm sure everybody is. It's a classic thing you hear about, but it really does do something special to the percussion loop and bus processing. It adds a really nice smack to it. You can use it for parallel compression. There's all kind of cool stuff. So we'll just go ahead and slap something on it. I'm going to use a free plugin from Cubase Audio. You can use any SSL bus compressor that you have. You can use the glue. Cytomic, the glue is really good. I'm sure a lot of you guys have some stuff from Plugin Alliance, which is also really awesome. I'm going to use this one. I'm going to go for a 2-to-1 ratio with a probably, let's just keep that on the 3 millisecond attack, and we'll probably do a 0.2 second release. I'm going to keep the dry wet to 100%, and we're going to try and aim for somewhere around 3 to 6 dB of compression, and then once we have that, we'll compensate that with the output gain of the compressor. So again, this is being applied to the all perc group. If I put that in solo, we can see that it solos the other two groups, and we're ready to go. Okay, so in this case, I might actually go with the 10 millisecond attack, which is letting a lot more transient through. It sounds a lot more snappy because it's not gripping down on anything until 10 milliseconds after it passes the threshold. So once we get that 3 to 6 dB, we're going to, again, compensate with the output gain, and then we should be able to A-B compare and get a fair comparison in the same relative loudness. So you hear the groove that compressor is adding to our drums, just the way that everything is kind of popping on the one. You can hear the transients, and in general, everything is a lot more consistent, right? Those lower sounds are gelled a little bit better. Even though they're mixed low, they sound a little bit louder, but they're also gelled, and they all have that same vibe on them. So let's add our kick bass into that, and then we'll bypass this compressor. Or I should say, we'll enable this compressor so that we can hear what it's adding to the loop once we have our kick bass on. And if you think that it's adding too much character and you're not fully a fan of it, then we can also just go ahead and reduce that dry wet a little bit to let some of that natural bit of the original loop come through. Alright, so that's sounding really, really cool. To me, honestly, I handle everything on the individual level. I get stuff really close, and then I have my pre-groups where I'll change the sound of everything together. So everything should be sounding in the same ballpark. What I'll do on this all percussions loop is really just vibe stuff. So that's probably normally what I would do 90% of the times is just add a little bit of a bus compressor, an SSL style compressor, maybe, you know, transient shaper, again, really, really rare that I would do anything else other than compression, and probably parallel compression. Again, maybe 50% of the time we'll do parallel compression. What I like to do for parallel compression is use a really gritty sounding compressor. You know, I'm sure you can find your favorite compressor, experiment, but what I would use in this case is I'm going to create an effects channel, and I'm going to use my outboard compressor, which I'm going to send out through 5 and 6. and I'm going to use my Drummer 1978 compressor because it has a built-in saturation circuit and it's got a pretty quick attack time and a long release time, which is generally the settings that you're going to want to use for parallel compression. So I'm going to go ahead and add this, and this should basically send out the audio to my outboard rack here. And I'm going to go ahead and add some parallel compression on that and see how that sounds. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up this all Percs group to go out to that send, which we're going to use as our parallel compression. Right now it's just called output 5.6 because that's the output I'm using on my RME sound card. And now I'm going to pop that out of solo. Now we can see that it's going through our output chain here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on my other camera here, and we'll move over to the Drummer 1978 in my rack, and we'll just start to listen and correct some of these attack and release settings. We'll adjust the thresholds so that we're getting the maximum amount of compression possible, and then we'll come back and we'll adjust the level of the effects return after. So. Alright, so that's about it. We've got our analog parallel compression set up using the Drummer 1978. We were just listening through the effects, we were just listening to only the return here. We could really hear what the compression was doing, and we've got that set up on our effects channel right here. So if we pull down the volume of this effects channel right here, we're essentially going to be left with only the original signal, which is just what's being sent through this group. If we want to see this fader as basically a dry wet level for our parallel compression, and we're going to mix in our parallel compression listening to the original drum loop until it's where we want it. It's going to be bringing up some of the lower level sounds, and it's going to be making the releases a little bit longer. So it's all up to taste. As I mentioned, the compressor that you use, if it's a software compressor, any compressor that's got the more color the better. You're going to want to set it to minimum attack time, long release settings, so you can get the most distortion and harmonics out of the compressor and really hear the most tone out of it and bring up everything that you want to bring up. And yeah, that's about it. So let's listen to what this Drummer 1978 is doing for us. Let's listen to that whole loop. We'll mute the parallel compression for now, and then we'll add it in after, and we'll hear what extra punch and smack that's giving our snares. And to me, it just sounds a lot more full and like a more professionally processed drum sound. So it's up to you if you guys want to incorporate parallel compression into your processing. But once you send everything out to groups, it's relatively simple to add this in. If you're lucky enough to have analog compressors, give that a shot there. They work great the more you push them, and they'll give you more color the more you push them. So In my compressor, I have a built-in saturation knob, which I've got at the 12 o'clock position. And yeah, here's what it adds. So I just reduced that a little bit, but yeah, adding some parallel compression really does something. I'm also using it to drive the level up to where it needs to sit a little bit. But of course it's, you know, like as we said, affecting the dynamics and giving it a more full sound, because that's what parallel or New York style compression does. Alright guys, I know it was a long one, but that about wraps up part 4 of the Back to Basics series, and we've created our full Psytrance drum loop. We took it from the basic 4 on the floor drum loop to a little bit more advanced and then got into the processing. I really hope you liked the video. If you guys learned something, or if you want to support the channel, please do give this video a like and drop me a subscribe. It really helps the channel out. I'll see you guys in the next one. If you have any more future requests or ideas for some more back to basics topics, please let them know in the comments down below, because that'll help the algorithm too. And it'll also give me some new ideas so I can continue this series with some useful videos for stuff you guys are interested in learning. So that about wraps it up. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.